Number 22, Metro Rail. When it opened in 1985 at a cost of $550 million, it was the most expensive public works project in Buffalo's history. Adjusted for inflation, that amount today, $1.4 billion, would be around the amount it might take to build a new stadium. Construction took 7 years to complete, changed the face of Main Street, some would say, to its detriment, and almost 40 years later, it's still operating much as it did, never having been expanded. But the debate on whether it should and where it might is still very much alive today. Number 21, bye-bye Braves. In a city where Major League professional sports teams have lost some big games in heartbreaking fashion, imagine the heartbreak of losing an entire team. The Braves played in the NBA in the 1970s, but late in the decade, the owner of the Boston Celtics, who wanted to have a team in his native San Diego but knew the league would not let him move the Celtics, approached the owner of the Braves and said, "How about we trade teams?" The swap was made, the league had no problem moving the Braves to San Diego, and it was game over for the NBA in Buffalo. Number 20, Madam Governor. This story, besides being number 20 on our list, is also the newest one. Just 6 months ago, when Andrew Cuomo, facing certain impeachment due to several scandals, including one involving sexual harassment, resigned, Kathy Hochul, as Lieutenant Governor, ascended to not only becoming the first female governor in state history, but the first Western New Yorker to hold the office in more than a century. Number 19, Summer of Protest. When a man named George Floyd was killed at the hands of Minneapolis police in 2020, the cries for justice rang across the nation and spilled into the streets, including in Buffalo, with thousands marching in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. While marked by pockets of violence, the demonstrations in Buffalo calling for social justice and police reforms were mostly peaceful, unlike in some parts of the country where there was rioting, looting, and burning. Number 18, October Surprise. It is not unusual for snow to fall here in mid-October, but it is when you get feet of it, such as what happened in 2006. The problem was that the leaves were still on the trees, the load of the heavy wet snow which clung to them, too much to bear for the branches, which came crashing down on power lines, leaving hundreds of thousands without power, some for almost 2 weeks. If there was a saving grace, well, it was October, so no one froze without heat or power because temperatures were back to normal and the snow was gone within a few days. The mess left behind, though, took weeks to clean up, and in just the city of Buffalo, more than 90% of the trees sustained damage, and a good number of them were lost. Number 17, Murder of Barnett, Slepian, Hunt for James Kopp. In October 1998, Dr. Barnett Slepian, an OB-GYN who performed abortions, was shot and killed in his kitchen by a sniper who fired from a wooded area behind Slepian's Amherst home. What became an international manhunt concluded about 3.5 years later with the arrest in France of James Kopp. Charged in both state and federal courts, it took more than a year to extradite Kopp, and it wasn't until nearly 9 years after Slepian's murder that he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison, where he remains today at age 67. Number 16, If You Build It, They Will Come. When it opened in 1988 as Pilot Field, Buffalo's new downtown ballpark was part of a bigger story. The Rich family's dream to bring Major League Baseball to Buffalo. Designed to be expanded to accommodate that, it was also the first in the nation to be built in the now popular retro classic design. It attracted praise and fans, as for several years, as the pitch for a Major League team continued, the AAA Bisons drew more than 1 million fans per season, outpacing the attendance of several Major League teams. In the end, the Major League dreams were just that, save for the past couple of seasons when, due to COVID, the Toronto Blue Jays temporarily nested here. Now known as Salem Stadium, it remains, though, the largest capacity AAA stadium in the United States. Number 15, Rebirth of the Waterfront. Buffalo's waterfront was essential to the growth of business in the city's industrial heyday of the 20th century, but it wasn't a place to visit, let alone reside, polluted and cut off by construction of the thruway. A sea change began with an emphasis on environmental cleanup and public access, which started in earnest in the 1970s with Erie Basin Marina, and then high-end condos and apartments eventually to Canal Side, Riverworks, and the Outer Harbor, which through restoration of natural settings and a planned amphitheater continue that trend. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither will the new Waterfront be, with additional chapters to this story to be written for years to come. Number 14, 5 men down. The largest single-day loss of life for the Buffalo Fire Department occurred 2 days after Christmas in 1983. While responding to a leaking propane tank in a radiator warehouse on North Division Street, 5 firefighters and 2 civilians were killed when the tank exploded. Damage from the blast was found in buildings up to a half-mile from the scene, and more than 150 people were injured by it. 38 years later, the site remains barren, save for the memorial at Fire Call Box 191, where the tragedy occurred. Number 13, bike path rapist caught. In 2007, one of the most notorious criminals in Western New York history was arrested, ending a reign of terror which some lawmen believe began 31 years before. An unassuming factory worker, a family man well-liked by neighbors living in Cheektowaga named Artemio Sanchez, those suspected of raping and or killing up to 15 women and girls, with many of those crimes occurring near secluded areas of bike paths and walking trails. Sanchez eventually pled to 3 murders, for which he is now serving a 75-year-to-life sentence. Police were finally able to make the case against him by getting his DNA from a napkin he used to wipe his face at a restaurant. His arrest also led to the exoneration of Anthony Capozzi, who had served 22 years in prison for rapes where DNA evidence now points to Sanchez as the perpetrator, but for which he has never been charged. Number 12, the PreSex abuse scandal. It's a story that stretches back long before television was even invented. Men of the cloth preying on parishioners, most of them young. The scandal involved the church cover-up, with priests accused, even credibly, far from being defrauded, being transferred to other parishes where the abuse continued. The story exploded in more recent years with the Child Victims Act, allowing the abused to bring civil lawsuits for that which occurred beyond the traditional statute of limitations. In the 2-year window provided for them to do so, more than 11,000 such suits were filed in New York State, and not just involving priests, but teachers, scout leaders, and others. The onslaught of lawsuits involving priests, though, forced the Buffalo Catholic Diocese, like several others, to declare bankruptcy. Number 11, the birth of the Bills. Though a pro football team called the Bills played in the All-America Conference for 3 seasons in the late 40s, it wasn't until 1960 that the team you now know was born in the American Football League, when a Detroit businessman named Ralph Wilson, whose first choice was to put his franchise in Miami, settled on Buffalo when his deal down south fell through. Initially, we may not have done a lot of coverage when those Bills were conceived. It was an upstart league, after all, and its owners, including Wilson, were referred to as being part of the Foolish Club. But the birth of the Bills makes our list because of what they would grow to be and what they remain to be in Buffalo today. Number 10, COVID-19. Even if you never caught it, even if you can say you never knew anyone who did, no one was immune from the eventual fallout from coronavirus, if for no other reason than the disruption in one form or another to our everyday lives, whether it was a change in how we worked or if we worked, how we shopped, where we could go, under what restrictions, how our children learned, or mandates involving vaccines or masks or gatherings, or the division resulting from our varied opinions on it all. It is without doubt that this story, of literally pandemic proportion, is the only one on this list which has impacted every single one of us, and the one to which we have devoted more hours of coverage than any other, and we haven't finished yet. Number 9, O.J. For a generation of fans of Buffalo's most popular sports franchise, O.J. Simpson was nothing short of an icon. His becoming the first NFL player to rush for more than 2,000 yards in a season made him a national superstar. And even after he hung up his cleats, his star continued to shine as a popular pitchman, movie actor, and network football analyst. But in 1994, he was charged with the brutal murders of his wife, Nicole, and her friend, Ron Goldman, and a nation watched in fascination, a slow-speed chase in a white Ford Bronco toward a trial which would span 11 months, broadcast gavel to gavel to millions, until his eventual acquittal. It was a big enough story to send our reporters clear across the country to cover it. Simpson would later serve 10 years in prison for armed robbery and assault before being released in 2017. Whether through fame or through infamy, O.J. was one of the biggest stories of the television era in Buffalo. Number 8. 22 caliber killer. In September of 1980, 3 men and 1 boy were killed within 36 hours of each other in the Buffalo area by someone using a 22 caliber weapon. In October, 2 more murders. This time the victims were beaten, their bodies mutilated. Then, on a single day in December, 4 more murders within an 8-hour period, all in New York City, where each victim was stabbed to death. And 1 week after that, 2 more fatal stabbings, 1 in Buffalo and 1 in Rochester. The common thread between the 12 murders and 7 attacks where the victims survived, all within 4 months, were that all of the victims were black. Cops who'd figured a serial killer was lurking got their breakdown at Fort Benning, Georgia, of all places, where an Army private named Joseph Christopher attacked a black soldier with a paring knife and told a psychiatrist that he had to kill blacks. Buffalo police soon obtained a warrant and searched his home, where evidence linking him to the first of the murders was found. Christopher was eventually convicted of 3 killings and sent to prison, where he only lived to be 37, dying behind the walls of a rare form of male breast cancer in 1993. Number 7. The Super Bills. A little over a generation ago, a team loaded with all-pros, many of whom would become Hall of Famers, accomplished a feat never done before or since by any other, when the Bills went to 4 consecutive Super Bowls. Through all those years, Bills fever was at a fervent pitch, and we spent enormous amounts of time bringing the story home. Of course, whether they were just a shade wide right, or if since then by some home run, throwback Music City miracle, or even if just by a measly 13 seconds, the thirst for an NFL championship for the Bills remains one to be quenched. Number 6. Timothy McVeigh. When in April of 1995 a truck bomb destroyed the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, the nation was shocked and grieved at the carnage and the loss of 168 lives. The shock deepened when it was determined that this was an act of domestic terrorism, and it deepened further in our region when it was learned that one of the perpetrators was a Western New Yorker. Timothy McVeigh, a 26-year-old Gulf War veteran and graduate of Star Point High School, and whose family still lived in Pendleton. 2 years later, in 1997, McVeigh was convicted on all the charges against him by a jury which recommended he be put to death, which he was in June of 2001 at a federal prison in Indiana at the age of 33. Number 5. 3407. In February of 2009, Continental Connection Flight 3407 from Newark to Buffalo crashed 5 miles short of landing in Clarence Center. All 49 souls on board were killed, in addition to a man into whose home the plane had crashed. The accident investigation found that pilot error was the cause, and 11 years later, it remains the most recent domestic aviation accident involving a U.S.-based airline that resulted in mass casualties. Some credit that to the tireless efforts of the loved ones and survivors of those killed, who, once their lawsuits were settled, worked tirelessly to improve airline safety and getting Congress to enact several measures to that end, including more stringent pilot training. Number 4. Love Canal. When toxic chemicals began gurgling up from basements and sewers in a Niagara Falls neighborhood in the late 1970s, it set off a firestorm above the ground. It eventually led to the evacuation of 800 families and the demolition of more than 400 homes. The name of the neighborhood, Love Canal, became synonymous with environmental catastrophe. The magnitude was so great that President Carter declared it a federal health emergency, and it marked the first time FEMA funds were used for a man-made disaster. Love Canal also became the impetus for the creation of the EPA Superfund and was the first entry on a list of what would grow to be more than 1,700 toxic waste sites tabbed for cleanup across the country. It took years to settle the lawsuits and for anyone to be allowed to buy homes on the outer ring of the disaster area. Many of the chemicals dumped in the 40s and 50s remain, but are contained and monitored for signs of leaching from the area, which is still fenced off today. Number 3, from fire to rust. Since 1900, it stood like a city of its own. The Bethlehem Steel Plant sprawled over 2 miles of Lake Erie shoreline in Lackawanna. But in 1983, the furnaces of the nation's third largest steel mill, which once employed 22,000 people, went cold and changed the local economy forever. And it wasn't just steel workers out of jobs. Facing a $4 million annual loss in property tax revenue, the city of Lackawanna laid off 100 city workers and 18 police officers. To this day, efforts remain to fill the once bustling site with new industries. Number 2, Attica. On September 9, 1971, inmates at Attica State Prison rebelled and took over the facility. When control was retaken by state police using helicopters, tear gas, and rifles, 4 days later it became and remains the bloodiest prison uprising in U.S. history. 43 lives lost, including 10 prison guards who'd been taken hostage. Most of the deaths were from bullets fired by lawmen retaking the prison. It took more than 3 decades to settle the lawsuits filed by the families of those killed, both guards and prisoners, and with the state paying $24 million, minus $4 million in court costs. Number 1, the blizzard of '77. Now, we've had our share of weather, but this is still largely regarded by many as the biggest, baddest, blowingest, beastliest behemoth of them all. After 34 days of below freezing temperatures and 28 days of snow, a snowpack several feet deep had formed on a frozen Lake Erie. On Friday, January 28th, a weather system with near hurricane-force winds came through and began blowing it into Buffalo. The system stalled. The blizzard raged for 4 days, drifting snow up to 30 feet in height. In the end, the financial tab was $541 million, adjusted for inflation, more than $2 billion in today's money. There were 23 deaths attributed to the storm. A quarter of those were people who froze in their stranded cars in the sub-zero temperatures. The blizzard was national news, and Buffalo became the butt of jokes by late-night talk show comedians. And still to this day, this storm is more responsible than any other for the perception, or in many cases, misperceptions by outsiders of Buffalo's weather.